Okay. Well, so what you can see on the screen now, what you can see here behind me is kind of like an inside and an outside view of this piece, which I made first for 6018 and then like expanded on for the show at the Cultural Center to kind of like fit the more grandiose scale of the space that we were suddenly finding ourselves in. So the piece is called, was at 6018 was just called Library of Refuseniks, but for the Cultural Center I renamed it the Emma Goldman Memorial Library of Refuseniks to underscore the connection with a Chicago figure that I thought was important to think about in this history of, you know, how immigrants are not only makers and doers, but also influential thinkers. And the series of Refuseniks, I actually started them as more kind of like small wearables, so garments that I started making in January of 2017. I found myself up in Banff at the cultural, what is it called? The Banff Center for Arts and Creativity up in Banff in the Canadian Rockies. And it was kind of weird because, of course, the inauguration was going on back here in the United States. And I find myself suffering from a great deal of like protest envy. And at the same time, also getting this moment to reflect and look at the situation from the outside. And I thought that's how you often find yourself as an immigrant, trying to, you know, like live the experience on the inside of the United States one at the same time. You know, you're reflecting, but also having to do quite a bit of explaining to your family back home, wherever they are, who kind of ask you what the hell is going on. And I still don't know the answer to that one, but I figured that in this series of work, what I was trying to do was to sort of accentuate or to underscore your right of refusal as a basic human rights and as a chance to give yourself a moment of pause and reflection in this situation. So the first Refuseniks were, as I said, wearables. They were kind of like person-sized, but they were constructed as a jockey jacket with a horse blanket, so that, because I figured that the refusing pony should be our therapy animal for the new regime. And I thought of the word Refuseniks more in the general term of being a conscientious objector. I later started looking into the history of Refuseniks as a Jewish diaspora that were actually that were refused exit from the Soviet Union in the 70s and early 80s. And so there's also the difference between being allowed entry or being allowed exit. There's the difference between the door being closed from the inside or from the outside. But to begin with, it was just sort of like creating a small TAC, so a temporary autonomous zone around the body where you could give yourself a moment to pause and reflect and acquire knowledge, or so that you wouldn't have to only react in the moment, because it was a very overheated moment where I felt that along with the protest envy, there was also a lot of protest fatigue, or like that whole internet moment had become so toxic that it became impossible to reflect before you reacted. So those were some of the thoughts that went into the work. And then when Tricia asked me to make a piece for 6018 in 2018, if I'm correct, And we talked about how this like small, personal space could become more of a shared space, and how it could become a living architecture. And so it seemed natural to make a library like those kind of like porous archives, say sourdoughs, have also been recurrent in my work in the modernism installation and so on. And I invited other people from the exhibition to also contribute various texts that meant something for their personal experience of being an immigrant. And it didn't necessarily have to be a political statement. It could also be a poetic reflection on it, because the personal is not only political but also poetic, and those like interest spheres overlap. Of course, the poetic is also political and vice versa. And so on the bookshelves, as you can see here on the screen, there are family photos from 1618, referring to the specific history of 1618 as a house that was built by immigrants with an immigrant architect. There are also some of my own personal, like photos from my personal archive, and other people have contributed either family photos or personal texts that, in some way related to their immigrant experience. So also to just underscore that the immigrant experience is pluralistic. It's very personal. It's not always to just be projected in some kind of like, how do you say it, some kind of like umbrella term. And we each of us have a lot of luggage, a lot of baggage that we carry with us as we roam. So I've kind of wanted it to be a, say, portable and wearable library that is still in flux, like that is not static but remains in motion, and all these texts wash through it. Oh yeah, one thing that I found out that I kind of think is like nice and poetic in all of this was that while I was making this piece, and especially while I was building this, like, making this humongous like textile piece for the cultural center, and I was looking into more like into Emma Goldman's biography, it turned out that she actually came to the United States as a seamstress, worked as a seamstress in various sweatshops in New York before she moved to Chicago. And I just thought it was nice to like dedicate this piece to seamstresses everywhere, because of that, connection with the needlework, the Hausfrau, the like unseen labor, the care labor, the politics of care labor that connects us. And of course, I found that Goldman was also an inspiration and aspirational figure in the way that she lived her life, to the max, politically, and personally. And you may not know this, but she's actually buried out in Oak Park. Her remains were exhumed in Canada, and she was brought home to the United States and to Chicago after her death.